Hi students, this is Mrs. T with another video about cultural geography, and we are getting closer and closer and closer to that stage one in the demographic transition because we are finally going to talk about the agricultural revolution, the first agricultural revolution. So we've been talking about subsistence strategies, so you know that's a plan for food getting, a plan for survival every day, food, clean water, shelter if necessary. So far we don't have to have a plan for oxygen, it's just kind of there. I say so far because, people want to make a colony on Mars. I don't know the why of where in that regard, but that's a whole nother geography class. So let's talk about the first agricultural revolution. So there are three agricultural revolutions. You can see on the website behind me this gorgeous creature. I don't know if that's a yak or a cow or what, but he is just so pretty. A cattle or a bovine, I mean. Cows are female, but I don't know if that's a bull or what, but he is just so pretty. It might be a yak. I don't know. If you know, post it in the discussion board for us this week. Let's talk about the first agricultural revolution though. And what do you know? Here's a map, and we're going to talk about origin centers. And here's a little bit of discussion which summarizes about 40,000 years of human evolution and existence in one short paragraph, which is actually something that one of my cultural geography students a few semesters ago laughed out loud in the face-to-face classroom when we were talking about the first stage of the demographic transition, because I said, it's all the way up through forage, hunting and gathering, all the way up through industrialization, basically, when the industrialization hit. And he laughed because he's like, isn't that like 50,000 years? I'm like, yes, it is. So that's one of the reasons why I prepped you with the other subsistence strategy information before we went to the first agricultural revolution. So, agriculture is different from the other subsistence strategies because it changes the social norms, it changes the habits and customs and traditions of food getting so that food is produced in surplus. It is possible to produce food in surplus. Okay, so agriculture requires a lot of modification of the natural environment in order to, be able to produce in an agricultural sense. You have to be able to control and predict irrigation much better than you can in, say, horticulture. And so in agriculture, you see a lot of modification of the environment. For instance, I remember reading an archaeology paper that focused on the Hopi of Arizona, and they built a very complex canal and reservoir structure for their agrarian society it was really like an empire, if you ask me. In Arizona, they had a river that brought water to the area, but it didn't bring water to the desert parts of the area. So they built these complex canals with dams and locks in them even, and reservoirs where they could store water to irrigate the dirt and make it arable so that it could support more of the community. So those kinds of innovations occurred with agriculture. So there was extreme modification of the environment. But with the first agricultural revolution, you were talking about increased production so the population could go up much higher. But also with the first agricultural revolution, you end up with a very different concept of what land is for. If surplus food is produced on land, and food is the primary resource that human work is devoted to, then the land itself becomes very valuable. Now, when I was talking about pastoralism, I talked about how the herd of animals, whatever the herd is, the herd itself represents the wealth of the kinship group that owns it, or that controls it, whatever. If maybe ownership is not even a word that exists in their languages, I'm not sure. But ownership is definitely a word that exists in agrarian culture ideas. Sorry, that's my husband calling me. He'll just have to wait. Anyway, so ownership and therefore social stratification between owners and non-owners explodes with agricultural revolution, with the first agricultural revolution. So you can see that we're talking about 2000 BC all the way up to basically when the Industrial Revolution happened. The Industrial Revolution really caused some extreme innovations with agriculture. So that's when we call it the second agricultural revolution, when industrialization started. But if you will look at this brief description on this website, cities started happening for the very first time. But notice the author of this website is careful not to use the word urbanization, because cities is different really than urbanization that happens when factories become part of the division of labor landscape. In the first agricultural revolution, the division of labor is not just on gender roles like I told you about before, but also on physical capability and ownership versus worker relations. So some people own the land. That might not mean that they actually work the land themselves. That might mean that they pay wages to or even enslave people to work the land for them. You might know about a famous enslavement story, the Israelites being enslaved. And the part of the story that we know the most about probably is that they were forced to make bricks to build monuments for the Pharaoh and all of this kind of stuff. However, the majority of the Israelites were used for agrarian purposes because agriculture was the way there was wealth in the area. So agriculture brings us surplus. It brings specialty areas. One crop grows better here than it grows there. It also brings a greater division of labor. You only have the most fit as far as like physique goes, people who are working the land. You do have domesticated animals, beasts of burden that I mentioned in previous lectures, that work the land with you, hauling out tree stumps. There's ropes that you haul tree stumps out of. Don't think of those metal plows yet that you saw on shows like, I don't know, Little House on the Prairie or something, because those weren't readily manufactured yet. If somebody made one themselves with their own hands, that's different, but they weren't widely available. There was still a lot of what we call manpower used to produce this food, but there were also other divisions of labor. So instead of elders in the society teaching the youth, teachers and schools became dominant. Religious experts became dominant. Also, government had to happen. Economic exchange had to happen. These cities that I still have highlighted here, these cities were exchange places. And if you can see these areas highlighted on this teeny tiny map, these are all around rivers. The Nile River, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Indus River Valley, and this tiny isthmus we know as Mesoamerica that connected Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean. So these were around water supplies. Don't forget the Wanghe River over here. Almost missed that one. The why of where for these locations is because water was plentiful. Transportation to central locations where cities were formed, like Alexandria, for instance, or in Mesopotamia, these kinds of places, were central trading posts where economic activities could happen. Economic activities related to the surplus you were producing in agriculture that enabled your population to boom and enabled your culture to be transmitted when food was transmitted from Mesoamerica up into what is now the United States, or transmitted from the Nile Valley into other parts of coastal Africa or down onto the Indian Ocean coast. All of these hearths, let me scroll down here. I think that the next one, yes. So the next map shows the 5 agricultural hearths, Mesoamerica, the ones that I mentioned before, and the trade routes that the products produced in these areas transitioned from these locations outward. So this is how diffusion occurs. This is how movement of Mr. Help, first we have the region, we have the location description, we have the place description, we have the human environment interaction. Now we have the movement of these products and also the ideas that come with those concentration of people in those cities. You see them dispersing from these cultural hearths of agriculture into other parts of the world. So we're looking at really early human history now, that when populations blow up, really. Look at, you know, a movie. Have you seen the movie Apocalypto? I use that movie, or I allow my sociology students to use that movie to analyze with some of the theoretical perspectives in sociology sometimes. But, you know, have you seen Apocalypto? Have you seen, goodness, what's the name of the animated movie, Prince of Peace, I think it is, that shows like an example. It's animation, it's a cartoon, but it shows an example of like a city that the sole purpose of the city is to have a farmer's market, kind of. For you and me, we know farmer's market in the open air on a street, but the entire city would be commerce like that, where people bring carts from the countryside and they have their donkey or their horse or whatever drag their cart from the countryside into the city to sell whatever their harvest is, to bring back their profit for the family for the next cycle of you know, economic season. With the first agricultural revolution, you were still limited to the seasons of the year, because there wasn't a whole lot of artificial irrigation, artificial greenhouses and things like that to enable you to grow things 12 months out of the year. So isn't this interesting that you can see that the equator is here, and most of the activity where human population existed is within the Tropic of Cancer area of the world, which you see here. You've got the tropical or subtropical climates that enable you for the longest growing season, you know, in order to produce these things. Also, with the first agricultural revolution, there was not a whole lot of variety. People got expertise in one particular thing, and there wasn't, you know, a ship from the shore of China that arrived in California, for instance, in order to produce, to disperse things. You didn't have avocados from Mexico, for instance, in Florida, and those kinds of things. But you did have some dispersal of this agricultural knowledge, and also the products that were part of the yield of the agricultural habits that spread from these hearths to parts of the rest of the world, and population grew because the food supply was much more secure. Food security was firmly established during this first part of the first agricultural revolution. But you know what else was firmly established? Social inequality. This is the steps of the very first social problems that we try to solve in social science classes these days. So we're going to be looking at a lot of social problems from now on when we examine agriculture a little bit more in depth in future lectures, and also the epidemiological transition model that I'm going to introduce to you, which happens because populations increase, and therefore there's more people to catch more diseases, and you know, the population is controlled somewhat based on those diseases killing folks off. Unfortunately, sounds harsh, but true. Okay, so this is your first lecture on the first agricultural revolution. Please text me with questions. Bye.